My name is Priya Nair, and I am 28 years old. And I want to tell you about the Saturday evening in October when my family came to dinner at my hotel, and my CEO stood up and introduced me to the room in a way that produced a silence at their table that lasted, by my cousin Rohan's later admission, almost 2 full minutes. To understand why that silence mattered, you need to understand the previous 4 years of dinners at my family's table, where I was the subject of the specific, comfortable condescension that families deploy when they have decided what someone is and have stopped questioning the assessment. I grew up in a Tamil Indian family in Houston, Texas. My parents are both physicians. My brother Dev is in his residency in neurology. My cousin Rohan works in investment banking in New York and sends my aunt a photograph of his office view every time it changes, which it has apparently done 3 times in 4 years. The family operates on a specific, understood metric of success that has medicine and finance at the top and everything else arranged below in a hierarchy that nobody has ever stated directly and that everyone understands completely. I have a degree in hospitality management from the University of Houston. I graduated in the top third of my program with a focus on operational systems and guest experience design. I wanted to work in hotels, specifically and deliberately, because I had understood since my first hotel industry internship at 19 that hospitality done well is one of the most technically demanding and emotionally complex businesses that exists, and that most people underestimate it because they are looking at the surface of it rather than the architecture beneath it. My family looked at the surface of it. When I took the front desk associate position at the Whitfield Austin at 24, my family received the news with the specific, careful warmth of people who are managing disappointment and want you to know they are supportive while making sure you understand they are disappointed. My mother said she was proud of me for finding my footing. My father said he was sure I would work my way up quickly. My aunt said I needed to think about my long-term future. My cousin Rohan said, at least the hotel industry has good benefits. I said, thank you, to all of them. I went back to Austin, I went to work. What I did not tell my family was what I was actually doing at that front desk, because what I was actually doing was not what they had decided I was doing, and explaining the difference would have required a conversation about the distinction between a job's title and its substance that I did not have the energy to have with people who had already made their minds. The Whitfield Austin was one of 11 properties owned by Whitfield Hospitality Group, a privately held company founded by James Whitfield, who had started with a single budget motel in Arkansas in 2001 and had built it into a mid-tier hospitality group with properties in 6 states over 23 years. James was 51 years old and ran his company with the specific operational focus of someone who had built everything from nothing and who understood every level of the business because he had worked every level of the business. He visited each of his properties twice a year and spent time on the floor rather than only in the management offices. This was known to the staff at the Whitfield Austin, and it was known that he paid attention when he visited, and that his attention was specific rather than general. I had been at the front desk for 3 months when he visited for the first time. I did not know who he was when he checked in. He had booked under a name that did not immediately identify him as the owner, and I had processed his check-in the way I processed every check-in, with the complete attention I brought to every guest, regardless of any information I had about them in advance, because I had decided early in my career that varying the quality of attention based on a guest's perceived status was both ethically wrong and operationally stupid. After his check-in, he sat in the lobby for 45 minutes with a coffee and a notebook. I did not know he was observing. I processed 11 more check-ins, handled a billing dispute with the specific combination of firmness and warmth that billing disputes require, redirected a frustrated guest whose room had not been ready with an upgrade and a genuine apology that addressed the inconvenience specifically rather than generically, and coordinated with housekeeping twice by phone about a situation on the fourth floor. He introduced himself to me before he left the lobby. He said he was James Whitfield and he owned the property, and he had a question for me. I said, of course. He said, the workflow you used for the billing dispute earlier, is that your own protocol or something from the training manual? I said it was my own. I said the training manual protocol produced good outcomes about 70% of the time, and I had been working on adjustments that I thought improved that. He said, can you write that down for me? I said, yes. He said he would be in his room until 6. I wrote it down on my lunch break. I slid it under his door at 4:30. He read it that evening and emailed me through the property system with 3 questions. I answered all 3 before the end of my shift. He sent one more message that said, I will be in touch. That was the beginning of 14 months of James Whitfield paying close attention to what I was doing, and me continuing to do what I had been doing before he started paying attention, which was work on every problem I could identify in the hotel's operations, regardless of whether the problem was technically within my job description.
The 2 promotions happened at month 4 and month 10. The first moved me from front desk associate to guest experience coordinator, which came with a title and a salary adjustment and a specific responsibility for monitoring and improving the guest feedback metrics across the property. The second moved me to director of guest experience with oversight of the front desk team, the concierge function, and a new guest recovery program I had designed and proposed in a 15-page document I had spent 3 weekends writing. I did not tell my family about either promotion, not because I was hiding them exactly, because every time I had mentioned my work at previous family gatherings, the response had been the specific, encouraging diminishment of people who were trying to be supportive while remaining fundamentally unconvinced. And I had made a decision at some point that the work was the work, and the work was not something I needed to present for assessment to people who did not have the framework to assess it accurately. My cousin Rohan asked at Diwali whether I was still at the hotel. I said yes. He said, front desk? I said, no, director of guest experience now. He said, oh good, you are moving up. He said it with the specific warmth of someone who is genuinely pleased that you are making progress toward something he considers real, which told me that director of guest experience did not yet register as real to him. I said yes and changed the subject. My aunt said I should think about whether there was a path to management. I said there was, and I was on it. She said good. She patted my hand. I drank my chai. What none of them knew, because I had not told them and had no particular plan to tell them, was that the 15-page document I had written had become the foundation of something James was calling the Whitfield Guest Excellence Initiative. He had been testing elements of it at the Austin property for 5 months, and the metrics had moved significantly enough that he had decided to formalize it as a company-wide program. I was leading the program development. I was also presenting at the annual partner conference in San Antonio in October, where James's investors and senior partners gathered to hear about the company's strategic direction for the coming years. The conference was the kind of event that I had been working toward without knowing I was working toward it, which is how most significant professional moments arrive. You are building toward something, and the building is the whole story, and then one day the something arrives, and you understand that the building was the point all along. I drove to San Antonio on a Thursday and checked into the conference hotel and spent Friday in preparation meetings with James and the operations team. I was scheduled to present on Saturday afternoon. My uncle called me Friday evening. He said he and my family were in San Antonio for the weekend visiting friends, and would I be free for dinner Saturday? I said I was attending a work conference, but I could meet them for dinner after my presentation if the timing worked. He said, come to the hotel restaurant at 7. We will have a table. I said I would be there. I did not tell him which hotel I was working at. My presentation was the second of the afternoon session. I presented for 35 minutes on the Guest Excellence Initiative, the data from the Austin pilot, the projected impact across all 11 properties, and the implementation timeline for the rollout. The room was approximately 60 people, investors and senior partners and senior leadership from across the company. I had presented to difficult rooms before. This was not a difficult room. This was a room full of people who were in the business and who understood what the numbers meant, and who asked good questions that I answered completely. After the presentations, James made remarks to close the afternoon session. He talked about the company's direction, and then he talked about the people who were building it. He said he wanted to introduce his team. He introduced 4 people. I was the third. He said, "I want you to meet Priya Nair, our Director of Guest Experience at the Austin property and the architect of the Guest Excellence Initiative that we are building our next 3 years around." He said, "When I first met Priya, she was at the front desk, and I want to be specific about that because I think it is important. She was at the front desk and she was redesigning the workflow on her lunch break and sliding the redesign under my door at 4:30. That is the kind of person who builds things." I said, "Thank you." I shook hands with several partners. The session closed at 6:30. I went to the hotel restaurant at 7 and found my family at a table near the window, my parents and my uncle and aunt and Rohan, who had apparently come to San Antonio for the weekend on short notice, and my brother Dev, who was visiting from Houston. 6 of them at a round table in the restaurant of the hotel where I had just presented to 60 investors. I sat down. We ordered drinks. The conversation was the usual conversation. How was Dev's residency? How was Rohan's project? How was my drive from Austin? I had been at the table for about 20 minutes when James came into the restaurant with 2 of the senior partners. He turned to the table and said, "Priya, I'm glad I caught you." He turned to the table and said, "I'm James Whitfield. I own this hotel and 11 others." He said, "Priya is one of the most important people in our company right now." He said, "Whatever she has told you about her work, she has probably undersold it." He shook hands with my father. He said, "You must be proud of her." My father said, "Yes, very." He said it without hesitation. He said it before he had fully processed what he had just heard. James said it was a pleasure to meet them and went back to his table. My family looked at me. My aunt opened her mouth and then closed it. Rohan was looking at the table. My brother Dev said, "Priya, how long has this been going on?" I said, "About 14 months. He said, "And you did not tell us?" I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because every time I mentioned my work at family dinners, someone asked if I was still at the front desk. Nobody said anything for what Rohan later told me was almost 2 minutes. My father spoke first. That was characteristic. My father processes things quickly and speaks when he has something specific to say, and what he said was, "Priya, I owe you an apology." He said it directly and without the qualifying language that apologies sometimes come wrapped in. He said, "I have not understood what you were doing, and I have not asked the right questions, and I am sorry." I said, "Dad." He said, "Let me finish." He said, "Your mother and I raised you to work hard, and you have worked hard in a direction we did not understand, and that is our failure, not yours." I said, "It is not a failure." He said, "It is a failure to see clearly what is in front of you. We should have seen it more clearly." My mother reached across the table and took my hand. She did not say a lot. She said, "I'm proud of you." She said it the way she said things when she meant them without reservation. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "I should have said it more clearly before tonight." I said, "You said it in other ways." She squeezed my hand. Rohan and I talked for a long time after my parents and aunt and uncle had said goodnight. We sat at the table until the restaurant was mostly empty, and he was honest in a way he had not been before, which was that he had been operating on an assumption about my career that he had never questioned because the assumption was comfortable, and it had been reinforced by every gathering where nobody pushed back on it. He said, I compared you to myself constantly without knowing anything about what you were actually doing. I said, Rohan, I did not tell you what I was doing. He said, you should not have had to make a case for your own work at family dinners. I said, no. I said, but I stopped trying to, and that was also a choice. He asked about the initiative. I told him about it for about 40 minutes, and he listened with the specific quality of attention that is different from polite listening, the kind where someone is actually absorbing what you're saying and thinking about it, rather than waiting to respond. He asked good questions. They were the kind of questions someone with a finance background asks about a business initiative, and they were useful questions, and I answered them, and by the end of it he said, Priya, this is genuinely impressive work. I said, I know. He laughed, I laughed. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years, and it happened because a CEO introduced himself to my family at a restaurant table and said, whatever she has told you, she has probably undersold it. James asked me the following Monday how the family dinner had gone. I said it had been informative. He said, I hope I didn't overstep. I said, you introduced yourself to my family and said something accurate about my work. He said, you've never talked about them much. I said, there were some things to work through. He said, family is complicated. I said, family is complicated, and it is also worth the complication when the complications produce honest conversations. The Guest Excellence Initiative rolled out to 3 additional properties in the first quarter of the following year. By the end of that year, it was in 7 of the 11 properties. By the time I'm telling you this story, it's company-wide, and I'm leading it from a new position, Vice President of Guest Experience, which my cousin Rohan described in a text message as actually impressive when the announcement went out. I sent back a thumbs up. Some things you receive with the minimum required response and move forward. My aunt called me after the announcement. She said she had been thinking about what she said at Diwali about thinking about my future. I said, Auntie, I've been thinking about my future continuously for 4 years. She said, I know that now. She said, I didn't know it then because I wasn't looking carefully enough. She said, I'm sorry, Priya. I said, I know. I said, the next time you're in Austin, I want to take you to the hotel. She said, I would love that. I work every day in a building where I used to stand at a front desk and redesign workflows on my lunch break and slide documents under the CEO's door. The front desk team now reports to a manager who reports to me. The workflow I designed in month 3 is the standard protocol across 11 properties and has been cited in 2 internal efficiency reports as the highest impact single operational change in the company's recent history. None of that happened because someone in my family believed in it early. It happened because I believed in it without needing anyone else to. That's the thing I want you to take from this story if you are in a family where your work is reduced to a question about whether you are still at the front desk. You don't need the table to understand it. You need to understand it. Do the work, write the document, slide it under the door. The right people are watching, even when the people at your family's table are not. The right people were always going to introduce you eventually. You just have to be doing something worth introducing. That's my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.